Welcome to Myco Minute, conversations about collaboration brought to you by the capacity creators at Myco Consulting LLC, where we help higher ed, nonprofit, and philanthropic leaders advance the initiatives they care about most.
Welcome back to Myco Minute. I am Deb Mashek, and today I'm speaking with Alison Taylor, who is the Executive Director of Ethical Systems. She's also a Senior Advisor at BSR, which is an organization of sustainable business experts, and an Adjunct Professor at NYU's Stern School of Business. Alison, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's so fun to get to talk to you on this Myco Minute informal conversation about collaboration. And I feel like my first question is a bit silly because I feel like everybody else knows the answer to this except for me. Tell me about ESG. I keep hearing it everywhere. I have only a vague sense of what the heck it means. So I'm wondering if you can enlighten me.
Absolutely, I will try. It is in fact an excellent question. So it stands for environmental, social, and governance, but that is in one way informative and in one way not. The way I would characterize ESG is I would say it is an effort to financialize the social responsibility or sustainability movement. And I'll be a little bit clearer here. So 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, you know, the idea was the business does what it does, it fulfills its core function, and then corporate social responsibility is something off to the side that has nothing to do with the core business. It is essentially donating to the CEO's favorite charities, and it is an effort to kind of counter what the core business is doing, but it's not directly related. From around the 1990s and then well into the 2000s, there was a shift in thinking in the corporate social responsibility movement to make it less antithetical to business. So the idea evolved to become something that's often called shared value. And so this was an effort to bring these concepts more into the core business function. And so the dominant frame at the moment is that you look for the overlap in the Venn diagram between how your business can create financial value and how you can create social and environmental value. So the dominant idea is to look for a win-win solution where you can both make more money and do good. That has led to a very instrumentalist concept of sustainability that has really found its full realization in ESG, which is an effort to quantify the financial benefits of these efforts. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is a highly debatable point, but there is a lot of energy in the investment community around trying to put numbers behind this right now, and that finds its fruition in ESG.
Amazing. That was really helpful. So then connect this for me to your organization, Ethical Systems, because I can imagine within the ESG space, there are a lot of ethical questions about whose interests we're really promoting and advocating and how we think about what's good for the communities and what's good for the environment. So what is Ethical Systems? Let's start there and then connect the ESG angle for me.
So Ethical Systems is a collaboration of professors that work on questions of ethical culture defined broadly. I would also say that the mission of Ethical Systems is to drive a more holistic understanding of what ethical culture and ethical organizations look like. So what is usually called business ethics, I would argue, has very little to do with ethics, unless you think the legal system is to do with ethics, which is clearly a huge and debatable point. So what we call business ethics has evolved into three separate but related concepts that are aligned with functions inside an organization. So you have the ethics and compliance team, which deals with legal and regulatory risks, so compliance with legal regulations. You have the human resources department, and the core role of human resources in the private sector is again protecting the corporate entity from litigation over harassment and discrimination, which pretty much explains a lot of things. And then finally, you have the the sustainability or ESG function, which is more focused on reputational risk. And one of my favorite characterizations of the role it fulfills at the moment is that it is really the paramilitary wing of the marketing department. So all these functions are to do with protecting corporate value and not really to do with ethics. But as a result of a lot of changes in society, how young people see the role of business in society, increased transparency, increased political activism, increased social activism, it no longer makes sense to build a defensive shield around an organization. And now it makes sense to think about what it actually takes to be ethical. So that's what ethical systems is trying to do.
So how does ethical systems approach that work? So it sounds complex because it's not just about what's happening within an organization, but it's actually changing the culture of the organization so that those, rather than the fortress, the walls, it really becomes more about permeable membrane of impact and influence and doing good and doing right. And how do you approach this work?
So one thing that we're trying to do, I think, or the main thing we're trying to do is to get the best ideas from academia, primarily from social psychology and behavioral science, but not exclusively, into the corporate sector. As you will know very well, academics are incentivized to publish and to a lesser extent to teach and not to engage with the private sector. Meanwhile, the private sector has a very conformist tendency, and there are a lot of consultants selling quote unquote solutions, and you benchmark against what your peer companies are doing and you do the same thing. And that will very often satisfy some of your stakeholders, but it does not lead to a lot of innovation or progress. So what we are trying to do is to build proper rigorous academic research in the private sector.
Wow. And so, yeah, so actually helping ensure that the private sector is adopting the validated practices from the social science research.
Yeah, actually trying to figure out what works. That's a relatively hard sell because doing this work properly is more complex, more involved, more time consuming. But in our favor, we are in a situation at the moment where there is very little precedent on things like remote work, diversity and inclusion, managing human rights risks, ethical leadership. And so if we're looking for what might work, we don't have a lot of practice to rely on. And so for some companies that think in a very innovative way, this is a very valuable service.
Right. So everybody I have this metaphor in my head of we're all trying to herd cats while walking on shifting sands through a blizzard to land on a moving target. Like nobody really has a perfectly clear sense of what the heck is going on. So that idea that we actually want to turn to validated strategies and the wisdom of other spaces makes a lot of sense. So you're bringing together behavioral scientists, social scientists. How do you get those folks to actually be interested in working together? Because chances are there's, not a one size fits all solution coming out of any of these disciplines. But then also, what strategies have you found effective for actually bridging the academic spaces with those corporate spaces?
I mean, it's an ongoing challenge. I think we have to provide a lot of the kind of translation and bridging services. So we need to be able to frame academic concepts in terms of solutions that will be valuable to business. We cannot go to business and say, we are going to do this research on you, and then we are going to advance the academic agenda. So we have to be positioning ourselves as being able to meet business goals and be flexible. And that means working with academics that can understand and adapt to that. If we're doing our job well, we can provide them with real primary data, which is very, very valuable. It's from real companies. It's not from the lab. But for sure, it is very, very difficult to find people who have both the academic rigor and understand the flexibility and the time pressures and the commercial pressures that you get with working in the private sector. It is not a meeting of minds. And so I think of myself primarily as a sort of translation service between the two disciplines. And it involves positioning and pitching in a very particular way, but I find it completely fascinating.
Right. I totally had the word translator in my head also, where, because, I think about the developmental trajectories of a lot of these professions and careers, and they diverge fairly early in one's history. So whether it's out of high school or out of college, but the academic path does not necessarily intersect much with the corporate path and vice versa. So, but you are unique in that you have a foot in both of these worlds. So I'm wondering, are there other features or characteristics that you would say these really are worlds apart, or where do you find points of overlap and similarity in terms of values or interest or drivers or concerns?
The degree and nature of collaboration in academia versus nonprofits versus the private sector is completely fascinating. You see very different motivations and very different ways of thinking. And I don't see collaboration as a particular priority in a lot of academic cultures. It's much more about your individual achievements. And so that the incentives kind of aren't really there. I've been surprised by how high commercial pressures are in academia. There's a tendency, I think, if you spend a lot of your time in the private sector, to think academia will be a big relief in terms of getting away from commercial pressures. They're still there. But one of the things that's really wonderful about working in academia is that you do have the time to think and develop ideas. You have time to explore ideas for their own sake. There is an understanding that all of this takes time. There is at least a conceptual understanding of the need for multidisciplinary solutions, and all of that is wonderful, because if you work in private sector consulting, which I did for a very long time, it can very often feel like you're on a hamster wheel with no time to focus on the interesting things, because you're always trying to kind of close and move on and provide solutions. So I've worked in the private sector and in nonprofits and in academia. They all have their flaws, but at the moment, I think academia is a very good place for me to be, and not least because I still have a lot of direct contact with companies, and that's very, very important to me.
Yeah, and I'm even thinking of, you talked about the incentive structures in academia, and in some disciplines, it's standard to do, say, even sole publications. And so, you are what your publication record says you are, and there's a lot of identity wrapped up in that. So I can imagine the idea of, collaborating or sharing that with others, it varies a lot, I think. Now, tell me about BSR. So you're a senior advisor there, and I admit I'm not very familiar with what the organization is about, and I'm wondering if you can tell us its origin story, because I think, as I understand it, this connects very directly to this issue of collaboration.
Absolutely. So BSR was founded in the early 90s. It is probably the most well-known nonprofit in the US working on sustainability issues. We might also see ESG issues. It's been around since the early 1990s, so it's really gone through that evolution of this field. It's a member organization. It has about 300 member companies. They are large multinationals: Walmart, Facebook, Gap, BP, ExxonMobil, every large business, or almost every large business, is a BSR member. BSR does sustainability consulting work, but of more relevance to you, it runs around 30 multi-stakeholder collaborations, some of which are groups of companies, some of which are companies and nonprofits. So there is a human rights working group, there is a sustainable supply chain working group, there are many sorts of collaborations that are really aiming to drive systemic change by bringing companies and other stakeholders into the room and trying to co-create. So that's something that BSR is extremely good at, though it's an extremely difficult thing to do, as you know.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, what does that actually look like beyond, getting some stakeholders in a room and let's have a conversation? But how does the momentum build, and how do changes actually get made? So moving, kind of that idea of moving from innovation ideas, or having some prototypes of how we might do things differently, to actually changing policy and practice.
Very often, I mean, the role of these different groups varies. Sometimes they come together driven by the company. Sometimes this is something BSR comes up with and goes out and recruits. They're doing a lot of work around kind of resilience and climate justice, for example. There is very often an effort to kind of co-create voluntary standards, for example, around something. So a group of companies will sign up to a particular set of principles and then promulgate them and try and get more kind of adoption. And that in general is the theory of change and sustainability, that you get kind of collective voluntary adoption of standards and principles. And that is a way to drive change, or maybe even a precursor to regulation change. So BSR is very thoughtful, I think, about how they manage change and collaboration inside these groups. They're very able to sunset groups if they start to drift and if they start to not work. And one of my kind of observations about collaboration in general is that usually the issue is a lack of energy. Like everyone says, let's collaborate, but there isn't enough in it for the individual entity. And very often, kind of energy leaves and things drift. So it's pretty important to have concrete goals that are going to benefit everyone in the room. And it's particularly important, I think, that participants have a lot to gain and a lot to lose. So there's a fear of conflict very often, but conflict is an energy. Conflict at least says you've got enough of a stake to be in the room having a debate. So where I see these things go wrong is they become kind of zombie collaborations where no one's turning up and there's no budget and people are kind of drifting. So I think turmoil and conflict and high stakes can actually be a very good sign for your collaborations if managed properly, as you know very well.
Yeah, I love that. And also I hear the coalition of the willing, that, no one's being strong-armed into any of this, but also the importance of having the stellar models, or the early adopters can kind of energize later adoption. And then I'm excited to hear that they're good about sunsetting collaborations. That's one of the things that in a lot of academic collaborations, I too am always stunned at how long-lived they are when they're no longer serving a shared purpose. And I think often that's because nobody's really taken the time of articulating in a compelling way what that shared purpose is, or even what the indicators are that will be achieving them. So this idea of, actually having metrics and whatnot. So super helpful. Okay, I feel like this is another one of my obvious, maybe everybody else knows. What does BSR stand for?
It stands for Business for Social Responsibility. So that was the name on its founding, which I think was 1994. And as we discussed at the beginning, the idea of corporate social responsibility has morphed into sustainability, and now ESG is being used. Also, you probably would hear the term purpose, corporate citizenship. One of the issues of this whole domain is that there's a lot of very confusing terminology. Practitioners are always trying to kind of coin a new concept and say, this time it's going to be different, which is for all sorts of reasons. But there's been a kind of ongoing lack of credibility in the field. So ESG is the latest kind of iteration of this, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a new term in another few years.
So I want to transition us to organizational culture. So at Ethical Systems, y'all talk a lot about ethical culture. So I'm wondering what that means, and then thinking about how it might apply to the idea of an ethical collaboration.
Sure. So I think when we think about business ethics, as well as framing it in terms of either reputational or regulatory risk, we tend to, or the dominant approach in the corporate sector is to take a very individualistic level. So we assume that people are making rational cost-benefit decisions about whether to break the law. And even more importantly, we assume that the world is divided into good people and bad people. And if we find and remove the bad people, the system will not have a problem anymore. This is unfortunately nonsense, because if you find and remove the fraudster, but your incentive structure and your leadership and the way that you design your organization still remains the same, the high likelihood is you will replicate the problem. So we think about ethics as a...
Yeah, the social psychologist in me, I'm like, yeah, no, the context matters.
Exactly. So we think about these issues as an organizational design problem. And then I think we try to combine the smartest thinking from social psychology and behavioral science, while acknowledging that those concepts are unlikely to be sufficient on their own. So trying to be multidisciplinary and apply concepts from social psychology and behavioral science to, for example, how risk managers in the financial sector calculate and consider long-term risk. So we get discipline experts and then we bring in concepts and we see how they might apply. And hopefully then we have kind of more productive approaches that take into account the realities of how human beings think and behave, while also being grounded in understanding that anything we propose has to speak to people that have roles and budgets and particular job functions. So we can't be completely abstract and academic.
Right. So I'm trying to think if it seems like all of that would apply to the idea of a collaboration. Is that your sense too?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or do you actually
and I
use
think
that container of this is an organization in order for a lot of these ideas to be relevant?
Well, that's a really interesting question. One thing I would argue is that one of the reasons that these concepts of responsible and ethical business have become so salient is that one of the things that we see in the world is that the boundaries between the organizations and the societies in which they sit have become more porous, they've become more intangible. This shield doesn't work partly because of transparency and social media and political activism. And so if we think about something like employee activism, these are people who are members of society and they're members of the organization, and they don't necessarily become a different person when they go into the organization. So even the way in which corporations make money has changed and has shifted more to intangible factors like reputation and IP and R&D and brand value. So I certainly think you can't treat the corporate entity as a box with firm walls, and you certainly have to think about the role that corporations play in society. And our dominant frame has been competition and a zero-sum game. If you take the work of David Sloan Wilson or evolutionary biologists like that, then you can see that collaboration is just as much a part of quote unquote natural human nature. And so I think a big part of this is thinking about making money in very, very different ways. My colleague Tonsi Whalen at NYU would argue that one of the reasons that responsible businesses have survived the pandemic better than other sorts of businesses is that they're more in touch with their supply chains and they have more resilience. So that is in itself a more cooperative, unless you're not trying to screw over your suppliers, you're trying to ensure that they stay in business, and so you know where your products are coming from. That's a very obvious application where thinking in terms of in a less zero-sum way might drive a lot more value.
Yeah, and also this idea of holding, if not on par, but certainly holding in high regard the outcomes and interest of others with whom you're working and collaborating as a driver for some of the decisions we make. So the supply chain example elevated for me there. I'm wondering what advice you have for those of us who are interested in working in ethical cultures, or ethical systems, ethical spaces, both within our personal and professional lives. So what advice do you give to individuals, whether they're at the leadership level or perhaps not yet at the leadership level?
I mean, the most important point I'd make is not to underestimate the role of your individual agency. So one of the reasons that business ethics is in such crisis is that we outsource thinking about ethics to these oversight functions that aren't thinking about ethics. And so something I always say to students is, don't underestimate your own ability to intervene and your own ability to support your colleagues. I'm always very impressed to read these essays from young men trying to support, for example, their female colleagues through instances of sexual harassment. And by doing that, you can have an enormous impact on the system. So, of course, it is very easy to feel powerless as an individual in an organization, but by modeling such behavior, by asking questions, by having courage, by backing somebody up that makes an unpopular point in a meeting, you can really change group dynamics and really change norms very, very quickly. So I know this can be a little daunting. I also think it's encouraging. I think it is very important to pay attention to your own values. It's very important to be realistic about the fact that to be successful, you need to be able to work with people who have different values from you, and you need to be able to respect that. And the future of, I hope, business ethics is a lot kind of more deep thinking around that. So I would encourage people not to be daunted, and I would encourage people to think strongly about how you can be an agent of change and how you can support the people around you. And it may be easier and more impactful than it looks.
I love that. I've got like goosebumps under my orange shirt here. So Alison, I'm looking at the time and I think we need to wind down here, but if people are interested in learning more about you or ethical systems or BSR, where should they go?
They can come to our website, which is ethicalsystems.org. BSR's website is bsr.org. And for anybody who wants to get deeper in the field of ESG and sustainability, it's a very, very good place to start. They have a lot of resources, a lot of content, and a lot of ideas. I guess I would also add, don't be intimidated. It's not as complicated as it might seem, despite all the endless 3- and 4-letter acronyms.
And for those who are interested in getting a copy of Myco's 20-page collaboration guide, you can visit www.myco.consulting. And Alison, one fun fact is that we've actually known each other for a couple years, but we've never had a chance to meet in person because we had a happy hour planned right before the shutdown, and that went away. So I will be fully vaccinated in a matter of 3 weeks. And I cannot wait to get a happy hour on the schedule so I can finally hang out with you in person.
I can't wait either. I'm so much looking forward to it. And thank you very, very much for having me, Deb. This was wonderful to talk to you.